For years, life in the neighborhood was uneventful in the best possible way. The kind of quiet most people long for, a place where mornings started with the sound of sprinklers ticking across manicured lawns and evenings wrapped themselves in golden sunsets and the soft hum of porch lights flicking on one by one. I had lived here for over a decade, and in all that time, nothing ever happened worth talking about. No drama, no disputes. Just a solid, peaceful rhythm that made it easy to forget how complicated the outside world could be. The houses were tidy, the streets were lined with well-trimmed hedges, and neighbors generally kept to themselves in the way that feels respectful, not cold. My home sat on a corner lot at the end of the cul-de-sac, giving me a bit more yard space and a little extra privacy. I kept my property in great shape, not because anyone told me to, but because I took pride in it. My grass stayed green year-round, I painted the trim every few years, and I even added a few solar lights to the flower beds just to give it a warm glow at night. If anything, I was the kind of homeowner most HOAs would point to as a model resident. I paid my dues on time, followed the rules, and kept my head down. There was no reason for conflict. At least, there hadn't been until things began to shift. The change wasn't immediate. It started as a subtle tension that built so slowly I almost didn't notice it. A sideways glance during a morning walk. A neighbor who used to wave but suddenly didn't. Things that could be brushed off easily and usually were. At first, I thought maybe someone was having a bad day. We all have them. Maybe people were stressed, or maybe they were just wrapped up in their own lives. But then I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. A note left under my windshield wiper about how my car was parked too close to the sidewalk. A neighbor muttering something about rules being rules when I brought in my trash bins a couple of hours late. Minor things, seemingly inconsequential, but they added up. There was a pattern forming, I just didn't realize it yet. Then came the new neighbor. She moved in just 2 houses down from mine, and from the very beginning there was something off. On the surface, she was polite enough. She introduced herself with a handshake and a clipboard, mentioning her plans to get involved in the community. Her name was Stephanie, and she had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked a lot of questions about the HOA, about enforcement, about how things were handled when someone didn't comply with regulations. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Some people are just more type A, more detail-oriented. Maybe she was just trying to be informed. Within weeks of moving in, Stephanie had joined the HOA board. Not long after that, she was elected president. That's when the tone of the entire neighborhood shifted. Suddenly, the HOA newsletters were longer, more aggressive in tone, and included lines about community standards being reevaluated and enforcement measures being modernized. New signs started appearing at the entrances, reminders about overnight parking restrictions, noise regulations, even holiday decor limits. None of these had ever been strictly enforced before. The mood went from relaxed to regulated seemingly overnight. At first, I didn't see any of it as directed at me. I kept doing what I'd always done, mowing on Saturdays, putting my bins out the night before pickup, keeping my property clean. But then came the first interaction that made me stop and take notice. It was a Saturday morning, and I was trimming back a rose bush that had started creeping too far onto the sidewalk. Stephanie happened to be walking by, coffee in hand, clipboard under her arm, and she paused at the edge of my property. After a moment of silence, she said, "You know, technically, rose bushes aren't allowed to extend past the property line. I'd hate to see someone get written up for something so preventable." It was the way she said it, like it was a friendly tip, but not really friendly at all. It didn't feel like neighborly advice. Felt like a warning. I nodded politely, said I'd take care of it, and went back to trimming. But the whole thing stayed with me longer than it should have. It wasn't just what she said. It was how carefully measured and controlled she was, even in such a simple conversation. Like she was trying to figure out how much she could get away with or how far she could push. From that moment on, I started paying more attention. I began to notice how often Stephanie walked the neighborhood, always with that clipboard, always taking notes. Other neighbors started talking, quietly at first, then more openly. Someone got cited for having too many garden gnomes. Another for a hose left out overnight. Nothing major, but enough to unsettle people. And still, I tried to stay out of it. I figured as long as I wasn't breaking any rules, I'd be fine. But I didn't yet understand what kind of person I was dealing with. I didn't realize that when some people get a little power, they start looking for reasons to use it. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the clouds were building. And I was about to find out just how far one neighbor was willing to go to make life miserable, not just for me, but for anyone who didn't fall in line. What began as a single complaint quickly snowballed into a relentless pattern that transformed everyday life into a constant battle with the HOA. Within a span of just 3 months, I received a staggering 14 separate violation notices, each more absurd than the last. At first, I believed it was all a misunderstanding, the kind that could be easily cleared up with a quick conversation or a phone call. But that hope faded fast. The violations didn't just keep coming, they escalated both in frequency and pettiness. It became clear this wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about control, and someone was weaponizing the HOA to carry out a personal agenda. The first notice was about my trash bins. According to the letter, they had been left in view past the designated pickup time by less than 2 hours. I shrugged it off. Everyone had been late pulling in their bins at some point. But less than a week later, another letter arrived. This time, the issue was the length of my grass. Not unkempt or overgrown, just slightly exceeding the maximum allowable height by HOA standards. I double-checked with a ruler out of sheer disbelief. It was half an inch over. The third notice addressed the paint color on my mailbox. I hadn't painted it in over a year, and the color, a neutral dark gray, had been approved by the HOA years prior. But now, according to the violation, it no longer met the updated visual harmony guidelines. When I inquired about what those new guidelines were, I was told they were still being finalized, but that I was expected to comply in anticipation. That was the moment I realized these violations were not only poorly justified, they were arbitrary. By the fourth notice, which criticized my holiday lights being left up for longer than permitted, I began to suspect a pattern. And not just any pattern, targeted behavior. I asked around. No one else on my street had received a notice about lights, even though some still had full displays weeks after mine were down. Neighbors started expressing quiet sympathy, sharing knowing glances or muttered comments about how certain people on the board were taking things too far. A few of them admitted they were afraid to speak up, worried they'd become targets too. The fifth and sixth notices landed days apart. One accused me of having an unapproved potted plant on the front steps. The other claimed that my car was parked at an angle that partially obstructed the sidewalk. Again, both claims were exaggerated if not outright false. The plant had been there for years, and my car was parked exactly within my driveway lines. It felt more like surveillance than enforcement. I started to notice the HOA president's car passing by more often, sometimes slowing down when it neared my house. The clipboard she always seemed to carry no longer looked like an accessory, it looked like a weapon. Reports 7 through 10 bordered on ridiculous. One cited a discoloration on my roof shingles, which turned out to be shadows from overhanging branches. Another flagged my garden hose for being visible from the street. Then came a letter about wind chimes, stating that the sound exceeded acceptable community noise levels. Ironically, no decibel readings were included. Just a vague reference to resident complaints. Each time, I submitted responses, photos, and appeals, but they were either ignored or delayed. It became clear there was no interest in hearing my side. By the time violations 11 through 13 hit, the entire process had turned hostile. I was accused of harboring an unlicensed pet, my indoor cat, who never left the house. Then came a notice about improperly stored yard tools, which were neatly hung on hooks behind my gate. Finally, there was a claim that my porch light was too bright, violating light pollution standards no one could actually point to in the bylaws. Each letter arrived with the same cold tone, the same veiled threat of escalating fines, and the same signature at the bottom, the HOA president. The 14th and final notice was the one that broke me. It claimed I was running a commercial business out of my home because I worked remotely. According to them, having a home office and the occasional delivery constituted a violation of residential zoning standards. It was baseless, insulting, and completely disconnected from reality. But more than that, it was personal. This wasn't about my house anymore. It was about someone trying to make my life unlivable through bureaucracy and intimidation. The emotional toll by this point was real. Every day, I braced myself for the mail, dreading another letter. Another accusation. My home, the one place that should have brought peace, felt like it was under siege. I stopped parking out front. I stopped using my porch. I started documenting everything, taking time-stamped photos, logging interactions, recording phone calls. I had no choice. What was once a quiet life had become a fight to defend my right to live in peace. Looking back, the string of violations was never really about rules. It was about someone testing how far they could push, how much authority they could exert, and how silent their target would remain. They assumed I'd just roll over. But they were wrong. That last report didn't just mark the end of their harassment. It marked the beginning of my response, and I was done playing defense. After months of escalating harassment disguised as enforcement, something inside me shifted. Up until that point, I had hoped reason would prevail, that by responding calmly, complying where I could, and appealing where appropriate, the nonsense would eventually stop. But when the 14th violation accused me of operating a business simply for working from home, I knew this wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. This was a targeted campaign designed to push me out or break me down. That's when I made the decision to stop reacting and start fighting back. My first call was to an attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA law. The legal consultation felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. I laid out everything. Every notice, every appeal, every piece of correspondence. My lawyer, a seasoned litigator with experience handling overreaching HOAs, took one look at the paperwork and said what I had been waiting to hear. This isn't enforcement. It's harassment. He explained that while HOAs have the authority to enforce reasonable rules, they are not immune from accountability. In fact, he pointed out several potential violations of my rights, including abuse of authority, selective enforcement, and even potential defamation, given how the violations painted me as a rule-breaking nuisance to the rest of the community. We started with documentation. Every notice was cataloged and timestamped. Photos of my property were compared with those of neighbors who had not received violations for similar or identical conditions. Witness statements were collected from residents who were willing to quietly speak up. My lawyer even submitted a formal request for the HOA's internal meeting minutes and enforcement logs, citing state law that required these documents to be made available to homeowners. The goal was to establish a pattern, and we found it. Not only had I received more violations than any other resident in the neighborhood within the past year, but none of the reports were supported by clear precedent or consistent enforcement. It was a textbook case of selective targeting. Next, we issued a cease and desist letter directly to the HOA board. The letter outlined the unlawful pattern of harassment, challenged the legitimacy of several recent violations, and warned of impending legal action if the behavior continued. The tone was clear and firm. This was no longer a dispute between neighbors. This was a legal matter, and I was prepared to escalate it. It was a calculated risk, but one I was more than willing to take. The moment I dropped that letter in the mailbox, the power dynamic shifted. The HOA responded, but not with an apology. Instead, they doubled down, claiming their actions were in line with community standards, and that they reserved the right to enforce bylaws as necessary. However, the tone had noticeably changed. Gone was the smug confidence. In its place was caution, hedging, and vague language meant to create legal distance. They were nervous, and for good reason. My attorney filed an official complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs and began preparing a civil suit based on harassment, defamation, and failure to adhere to their own published procedures. The legal pressure began to unravel their position. When forced to produce evidence of consistent enforcement practices, the HOA faltered. They couldn't explain why neighbors with similar infractions hadn't been cited. They couldn't produce a clear or legal basis for some of their claimed violations. Worse still, several of the violation notices were missing key timestamps or lacked formal approval by the full board. These were procedural errors, but legally significant ones. In HOA law, process matters. Deviations from established procedure can undermine the authority of enforcement, and that's exactly what we were counting on. Behind the scenes, the ripple effect had started. Word spread that I had taken legal action. Other residents began to voice their own frustrations. Some quietly admitted they had received unjust notices but had been too intimidated to speak up. My case gave them courage, and suddenly the board found itself under public pressure as well as legal scrutiny. A few members distanced themselves from the president, including one who resigned altogether, citing ethical disagreements over enforcement methods. By the time our formal demand for mediation was submitted, the HOA was scrambling to regroup. They agreed to a closed-door mediation session instead of taking it to court, a clear sign they wanted this to go away. My lawyer and I went into that session with a clear goal: full dismissal of all violation notices, a written apology from the board, and the immediate resignation of the president for misconduct. It was bold, but justified. We had the leverage. They had the mess. The negotiation took hours, but by the end, the board conceded to nearly every term. The president would step down, the violations would be removed from my record, and a formal letter would be issued stating I was in good standing with the community. That moment wasn't just about personal vindication, it was about justice. It was proof that standing up to a bully, even one hiding behind a board title, can be worth it when you have the law and the truth on your side. The fallout from the mediation was immediate and far-reaching. While I walked away from the table with my rights restored and my name cleared, the HOA board was left to deal with the wreckage of their failed campaign. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood, not because I announced it, but because people talk, and the resignation of the HOA president sent a loud signal that something serious had happened. What had once been a silent, tight-lipped community suddenly came alive with whispers, speculation, and, surprisingly, support. For the first time in months, I wasn't just a target. I was someone who had stood up and won, and that shifted how people saw me. At first, the support was subtle. A few neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now waved as they walked by. Some dropped off handwritten notes expressing quiet thanks for standing up to the madness. One couple told me they'd nearly put their house up for sale after their own negative experiences with the HOA, but decided to stay after seeing someone finally take a stand. More than one homeowner reached out to share their own stories of being pressured or intimidated into compliance, often over infractions that weren't even valid. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just my fight. It had been a community-wide problem, and now the community was waking up to that fact. But not everyone was happy. A small but vocal group of residents, many of whom had backed the former HOA president, saw my actions as an attack on the system itself. They believed that by challenging the board, I had invited chaos into what they considered a carefully maintained order. Some accused me of overreacting, of making a big legal mess over a few small fines. A few even implied that I was trying to undermine the HOA so I could break rules freely. These criticisms didn't surprise me. People in power often attract loyalists, even when that power is misused. What did surprise me was how divided the community became, as if my stand had cracked open a long-standing tension between two visions for how we should live together. Despite the division, change was inevitable. The board was forced to conduct an emergency meeting to address growing complaints about enforcement inconsistencies, and for the first time in years, residents showed up in large numbers. The energy in the room was different, charged, questioning, no longer content with vague answers and procedural talk. Homeowners asked for transparency, demanded financial reports, and called for an audit of previous violations. A motion was introduced to update the community bylaws, specifically to include checks against abuse of authority and to establish an independent review process for disputes. It was voted on unanimously. Even the remaining board members, clearly shaken by the legal heat they'd just endured, supported it. Meanwhile, my name, once associated with trouble, began to carry a different weight. People began calling me not just brave, but necessary. I wasn't comfortable being cast as a hero, but I understood the sentiment. I had forced a conversation the community had been too polite or too afraid to have. More importantly, my legal push had established a precedent. The HOA could no longer operate like an unchecked authority. From now on, every letter they sent, every complaint they filed would be under a microscope. The message was clear: bullying through bureaucracy wouldn't be tolerated anymore. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The board, now under new leadership, made efforts to rebuild trust. They started by reviewing the most egregious past violations, expunging many of them from homeowner records. They also introduced a public feedback channel where residents could anonymously report concerns without fear of retaliation. I was invited, ironically enough, to help draft the new enforcement guidelines. I declined the formal role, but I did agree to sit down with the committee as a citizen voice, offering insight into how things had gone wrong and how they might be made right. The former HOA president, Lynette Hall, quietly moved out of the neighborhood just a few months later. Whether she left due to pressure or embarrassment, I never found out. But her departure marked the symbolic end of an era, one ruled by fear, favoritism, and unchecked power. In her place, a new board president was elected by a slim margin, someone with a background in mediation and community planning. They reached out to me personally, not to apologize, but to thank me for forcing a necessary course correction. It wasn't exactly closure, but it was a start. Looking back, the backlash was inevitable. Challenging a system always comes with consequences. But what mattered more was the clarity it brought. The way it revealed what kind of community we really wanted to be. The fight wasn't just about fishing rights or mailbox colors. It was about fairness. About standing up when something is wrong even when the cost is high. I didn't just win a legal battle. I helped ignite a cultural shift, one where the rules finally had to serve the people, not the other way around. When the dust finally settled, I expected to feel a clean sense of victory, something like relief, maybe even pride. But what I didn't expect was how deeply the entire ordeal would change the way I thought about ownership, community, and resilience. What started as a petty neighbor's power trip ended as a hard-won fight that reshaped not only the rules in our HOA but the culture around them. The legal win, the reversal of fines, the resignation of the president, those were all concrete milestones. But the deeper win was something far more meaningful. I had reclaimed not just my rights, but my peace of mind. And along the way, I found a level of strength and clarity I didn't know I had. In the weeks after the settlement, life around the cabin began to feel like mine again. I started fishing in the mornings without looking over my shoulder. The sun rose just as it always had, but now it didn't carry the weight of someone watching, waiting to pounce with a clipboard and a camera. Neighbors passed with nods instead of suspicion. My front yard, once the subject of citations for non-conforming vegetation, grew the same way it always had, only now it felt like a symbol of defiance that had become freedom. There was a strange peace in returning to the quiet routines that had once been disrupted by an endless barrage of threats and paperwork. But beyond the personal peace, something else was happening. People began to share their own stories, not just about our neighborhood, but about HOAs across the country. Through emails, conversations, and even online forums, I heard from dozens of strangers who had faced similar intimidation, unfair fines, and power-hungry board members. Some of their stories were even worse than mine. But what struck me was the common thread, a growing realization that these small organizations, while intended to promote harmony, could easily become mechanisms for control when left unchecked. My story had become more than just my own. It was resonating with people who had long felt voiceless or isolated in their experiences. That's when I realized the biggest win wasn't legal at all. It was the awakening, the understanding that standing up for yourself doesn't just protect your home or your rights. It gives permission for others to do the same. I hadn't set out to be a voice for anyone but myself, but by pushing back, I had helped carve out space for others to say, enough is enough. And that ripple effect became the most unexpected, most rewarding part of it all. People were no longer staying silent. They were organizing. They were educating themselves. They were taking their HOAs to task and holding them accountable in ways they never thought possible. As for me, I've stayed involved, but at a distance. I didn't want a board seat or a title. I didn't need the power. I just wanted the rules to make sense and to be applied fairly. What I did do, however, was document everything I learned, the processes, the legal steps, the mistakes the HOA made, the tactics that worked. I compiled it all into a resource for other homeowners to use as a guide when they face similar battles. What began as my private nightmare had now become something that could help others prepare, fight, and protect what's theirs. And maybe that's the ultimate irony of the whole situation. Lynette Hall, in her mission to control and intimidate, ended up sparking a movement that empowered more people than she could have imagined. Her attempts to isolate and silence me only brought more people together. The very tools she used, recordings, documentation, and the rulebook, became the same tools I used to beat her at her own game. And now those same tools are helping others fight back, too. I still think about my grandfather from time to time, especially when I'm out on the dock in the early morning. The mist rising off the lake just like it did when I was a kid. I think about his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in being prepared, and his deep respect for this land. I can't help but wonder what he'd say if he knew what unfolded here. I think he'd be proud, not just because I stood my ground, but because I did it the right way. With facts, with documentation, with purpose. In the end, this story isn't just about revenge or legal victory. It's about reclaiming your space, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, from people who think their titles give them more power than they deserve. It's about remembering that ownership isn't just about property lines or paperwork. It's about knowing that you belong somewhere, and that no one gets to take that away from you with threats or bureaucracy. I didn't just fight back legally. I fought back personally. And I won far more than the right to fish from my dock. I won back my voice, my confidence, and my peace.